Hello, and welcome to the Eat Real to Heal podcast. I am your host, Nicolette Richet, and you are currently listening to a special edition of the Eat Real to Heal podcast. This includes 9 interviews with participants that agreed to be part of my PhD research. And I'm able to submit these 9 interviews with these experts, with these people with lived experience, their knowledge, their expertise, their research, their traditional ecological knowledge, and so much more. We are centering the voices of BIPOC people, that stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color, across North America, to understand what are the barriers that exist in BIPOC communities for these individuals in being able to access the clean, fresh, real foods that are needed to be able to not only prevent, but also arrest and completely reverse chronic diseases all across the nation, our nations. So I'm very fortunate, very honored, very humbled that all of these 9 participants agreed to be part of this research and contribute their knowledge.
What structural and systemic inequities are happening where we're at the point where we can't even get what we need. We don't know how to properly prepare the bulk items. We're not eating communally. Or rushing, maybe having lunch in our car, that 5-minute break we have, gulping down something. You're not chewing your food long enough. It's just, we're in this toxic, fast-paced society, which is basically the outcome of the last 400 or 500 years of a very thick, capitalistic, exploitative society that has damaged human beings, soil, and people to the point where certain processes and practices around eating have been normalized, and we don't realize that it's actually causing illness. And to me, that's just that to me is really sad and really upsetting.
So episode 3 of a 9-part series, this includes Dr. Harper. Now, Dr. Breeze Harper, she's a renegade. She's doing incredible things in the world, just as all of our participants in this research are. Dr. Harper has a PhD in social sciences with emphasis in intersectionality, anti-racism, and racial gender inclusion equity. She holds an MA in educational technologies with an emphasis in racial gender inclusion, equity, and technology from Harvard University, where she received the Dean's Award for her master's thesis work on how racial gender privilege operates in cyberspace forums. She earned her BA in feminist geography from Dartmouth College and received the Innovative Thesis Award for her work on heterosexism in rural geographies. Dr. Breeze Harper has over 15 years of career experience as a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, ranging from curriculum development to conference planning to research and reporting, publishing books and articles, doing workshop design and facilitation, recruitment and retainment, and she is an incredible human being. So I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Breeze Harper, also known as Sistah Vegan. She's a bright light of energy, just as every single one of our participants are. So please, let's welcome Dr. Breeze Harper to the show. And you know what to do, folks. If you enjoyed this episode, please go back and listen to episode 1 and episode 2 with Dr. Lickers Xavier and Dr. Psych Williams Forson. They are both beautiful voices in this space, so wise, so intelligent, so liberating. And it's important that we all understand the information that is being shared here today and that we share it with others. So please spread this message, spread this episode, spread the entire podcast series out to everybody that you know so they can understand these very important topics that are affecting not just BIPOC communities, but members of every community globally. Thanks very much, and we'll see you at the end of the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Eat Real to Heal podcast. I am your host, Nicolette Richet, and on today's show, I am so very honored, pleased, and blessed to welcome Dr. Breeze Harper to the show. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to start talking about these really important topics around just health and food and nutrition justice as it relates to people of color communities.
And doing my research, it's amazing. After all of the years that I've spent in school, I have never come across any of these topics until I had to go dig for them and literally harvest them out of the vast amounts of literature that is out there, but not nearly enough. And this is definitely something that needs to be brought to light and be, talked about really in all households, not just in North America and Canada and the US, but every community that was ever affected by colonization in the world, which I don't know if there's any untouched communities anymore. Um, so I love that you have so much experience and you've done so much research in this area. So you're going to be helping our audience really, really understand these very, very important topics. So I just want to first start by saying that this is the third interview in a series of 12 podcasts. These interviews are part of my research dissertation for all you listeners out there. And today we are going to be talking about Dr. Breeze Harper's experience in all of those subject matters that she just mentioned. So before we begin, as we begin, I would love to know, how did you end up here today where you are? What was that journey that brought you here?
Yeah, so how I'm here today as someone who's just like deeply engaged in intersections of food and racial and nutrition and health justice. I'd have to go back almost several decades into the 80s in rural New England, where my parents took out a mortgage on 3 acres of land in a 99% white town, about 5,000 people at the time. And my father was really focused on cultivating abundance for his family and my mom too, on multiple levels. And he is someone from Walnut Grove, Mississippi. They did the Great Migration to Saginaw, Michigan when he was, I think, a baby, and went from that rich land that they had to industrialized north, which is the story of many Black migrants looking for a better way. And when my mom and he partnered and got married, they decided when they were living in Hartford, Connecticut, that they wanted to start a family on land and grow their own food, which is very rare in New England for a Black family. But my
Mhm.
father was able to do that in tandem with my mother working and getting a mortgage down to pay for land for this house. And what I got interested in was that my father would talk to me about the importance of soil and water, and
Mhm.
really talk about that the town that we had moved to had he had always had the water and soil tested when we were living there, because he said it was industrialized farmland and that they used a lot of pesticides, and talked about monoculture and what happens basically when you colonize the soil, right? Not just to colonize the soil to turn it into what's now called the United States, where I'm based in, but when you colonize the soil microbiome. And when you're creating not just these monocultures, where we were in a town where there were just fields of corn that were not even really wasn't really food, saying that this looks like abundance, but it's disingenuous abundance, right? It's monoculturals. And then at the same time, me and my twin brother were dealing with this monocultural system and a school system, which was very white supremacist. They didn't really want Black people to be there. So really paralleling the colonization of the soil microbiome being destroyed, and it kind of being a reflection of this monocultural, this colonialistic belief of how humans should or should not thrive, this destruction of the soil microbiome and the destruction of the human microbiome, the psychological, social,
Mhm.
whatever. To me, that was very powerful, with my father kind of telling these stories. So I'm saying and using these words now that seem kind of academic. At the time, I didn't have that language to really
Yeah.
understand the stories that they were weaving and what they were trying to cultivate for our family. And then, having access to orchard with these rich foods like peaches and apples. And my father just showing us, and he was a master, he's a master gardener. And he's like, they always just show you 2 apples in the store, but he and my mom were cultivating all these different types of apples, purple apples, yellow apples, getting this vegetable, this fruit that's one of the 3 indigenous fruits in that area were called pawpaw plant, all just really teaching us. And then I went through puberty and got my period, and my father learned that I was taking ibuprofen for my cramps. And he's like, you can't do that. You're going to kill your liver. And I'm like, but that's what they teach us in health class. You have a period and you bleed. That's it. You take some Advil. And he's like, well, what did our people use before? Like Black people, what were we using before all these pills? And of course I'm like, I don't care, I'm in pain. He's like, look around you. Like, he was trying to explain to me in the yard what's in the yard. And I honestly didn't care or listen. He was trying to explain dandelion. They call it a weed. It's not a weed. Red clover, they call it a weed. It's not a weed, right? What's the politics of calling a plant that has this rich history, high in quality, very cheap, that can actually help you with reproductive health, right? So there's just all this stuff going on. And I didn't really listen. And when I was in my early 20s, after college, after, basically not taking anything that my father said seriously, starting every morning in college, eating Hershey bars, drinking soda, just not really taking care of myself, graduated. And then I was diagnosed with fibroid tumors because I was wondering why. Why am I in so much discomfort? And I told my dad, called him one day and said, I have fibroid tumors. I know that's what mom had. And I feel like I don't know what to do, and then in tandem with that, I was at work and this woman saw me underneath my desk, just like in so much pain from my period, just bleeding heavy. And I went to work anyway. And she's like, you need to find out about Queen Afua's work. And I was like, who's Queen Afua? And she's like, she's this Afrocentric queen who uses Kemetic Egyptian healing diet that's vegan to help us with our reproductive cycle. She reminds us how we used to eat, how it should be. And then it kind of just all clicked, she showed me this book called Sacred Woman. And then it kind of clicked with me remembering how my father had kind of said this stuff, and the importance of that, and that these are not weeds. And I was reading her book and she's talking about nettle. She's talking about red clover. And then I remember my mom was 32 and she had a hysterectomy because she had fibroids, which is ridiculous. But that gets into the politics of, she didn't really need it. They were very tiny. But she's a Black woman, and do you need more Black children? That gets into who will have higher rates of hysterectomies versus if it's a white woman and you're trying to make sure that you're producing a nation of more white babies. Would the doctor have been more of an advocate for her not to have that? These things are very interconnected. So I started getting interested at the same time when I had a fibroid tumor. I was a graduate student at Harvard, just focusing on Black feminist theory and technology. And when I was introduced to Queen Afua's work, her book, Sacred Woman, and then started doing research, I was like, I had no idea that reproductive health issues like fibroid tumors are much higher among Black women, right? Oh gosh, I didn't realize that we had higher rates of maternal mortality, just everything. And, reading Queen Afu's book, Sacred Woman, where I don't agree with everything in that book. However, going back to what she believes to be Kemetic Egypt, where it was plant-based diets, holistic, greening the body, greening the womb, and what we lost because of enslavement and industrialization and colonization. And then also, I had met people who were vegan. They were mostly white before. It was really only focused on health without maybe thinking about the racial and gender violence of colonialism, but also focused very much on animal rights. And then Queen Afu was talking about how, the Black woman's womb, is suffering from over 400 years of this epigenetic trauma, right? Like
Yeah.
that, and that it manifests as disease, but also because of because of enslavement, because much of the loss of our foodways, what we used to do, the loss of land, because after emancipation, we were supposed to be given our 40 acres, that now we're here, right? And we're sick, but the allopathic institutions of medicine, they're not going to understand the depths of that. If anything, they're going to pathologize Black people who continue to be pathologized. It's your fault that you have high rates of hypertension, obesity because of the way you eat, because you're not doing this or that, and not looking at the deeper layers of a system that is on this continuum of, plantation colonialism and how it affects literally everything, starting with the soil microbiome that was colonized because it is reflecting the GI tract's microbiome, right? And then we've got our gut health that also affects the rest of our physical body, but also our spiritual health. So you've got all of these things entangled. And what Queen Afua focused on was something that I had never been introduced to on that interconnected level. Granted, I listened to my dad talk about this, but then with her book, and then suddenly remembering everything he had taught us and being on that land, I made the shift. I got really interested in really understanding how it's possible that I can go to a medical doctor in the United States and they are trained in less than, I think, 4 or 6 hours in nutrition. They're basically not even trained in the material or physical health consequences of systemic racism and colonialism. And then many of them have their unconscious or direct biases, anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, whatever your ethnic or racial identification is, that's not white. They have those, right? And then we're expected to be well. And that just blew my mind. So I made the shift. I said, I've never, ever, ever met any Black vegans. I know they exist. So I decided to adhere to Sacred Woman, Queen Afua's book. And I cured my supposedly incurable fibroid tumors within a year by converting to a strictly green, holistic vegan diet that she recommended. And I thought, this is not fair. Like, I think most of the women in my family had to have hysterectomies. Their wombs were just taken out of them as if that was the only option. My mom was 32, and I remember that. I was 6, but I remember my dad saying she had to have something done, and my dad was just, freaked out about that. I remember that. So when I had told him, I was like, I don't want this to be something that keeps on happening. It can't just be something that happens. Like, there's got to be more.
I love there's so many elements in what you said that I'd love to unpack and really dive into just to help people who are hearing this for the first time. Because like you said, medical school, we know studies have been done to show that medical schools across North America, most doctors receive less than 4 hours of nutrition training. But it's not just nutrition, right? Nutrition is a huge part. We all eat 3 times a day, plus snacks, plus beverages. And so, food is a huge part of our health. The nutrients are a huge part of your health. Healing the microbiome is a huge part. And that starts with feeding it the insoluble plant-based fiber and soluble plant-based fiber. We know that. So, but now to ask doctors to consider identifying their own racial biases, to consider understanding the history of oppression against Black people, Indigenous people, Spanish, any person of color, really. I mean, like, I can just imagine anybody out there who's never heard this before for the first time is getting the double whammy. Like, what? You can use food, you can green our body and heal ourselves and reverse disease, these incurable diseases. And there's this whole history around, that led to us having these, chronic diseases that are prevalent, at rates of 4 to 8 times higher amongst BIPOC members. So There's something very, very similar of your history and my history. My mom too had a hysterectomy when she was in her 30s. Same sort of thing. The doctor's like, let's just do that. In fact, the doctor suggested tying her tubes after she had her second baby, said, let's just tie her tubes. And my mom was like, do you ask other white patients that say offer this? And that really stopped him in his place. And she really realized the beginning of, the injustices around being a Black woman in a white world, because I was the only Black kid in my school, or a person of color. Yes, exactly. I figured. Um, Also, the doctor where I learned about food as medicine, he was actually a German Jewish doctor from 100 years ago. So in 1918, he was reversing cancer and other autoimmune disorders and tuberculosis and so on, using the same principles as Queen Afua. But he was a white German Jewish doctor, but he said something, and we actually have these words engraved on the door of our restaurants. We have plant-based whole food restaurants, and it says, our our external, no, the soil is our external metabolism. And there's something so beautiful in that, this man 100 years ago saying that, but your father saying the exact same thing to you as well. And how did your dad come to know this? What was different about your dad that many other people never knew this knowledge? Where did that come from?
I'm wondering if it's part of the memory of him being in contact with family members from rural Mississippi. Though he
Mhm,
left when a very young, he remembers the stories of. I remember him telling me that people would move to the city, be there for years, be diagnosed with something, and then say, I want to go back home to a rural area where I grew up to die there.
mm,
Start going on the land again, start gardening, start eating fruits and vegetables that they were growing, and suddenly they weren't dying.
mhm,
And he was just kind of interested in those type of stories, and he was just interested in growing and learning. So a lot of it he also just taught himself. He's always kind of been out of the norm. um,
mm,
and I think he has this desire as well for this concept of beloved community that goes beyond just human beings, but like, the soil microbiome as this type of beloved community, and how to keep
mm,
the soil. And I don't know concretely, how to tell you how he got to that path. But it just always felt kind of natural.
mhm,
And the way he perceives existence is not in a binary, but kind of interconnected and on a spectrum and a continuum. And I remember just the way he raised my twin and I is that you're a spirit having a human experience who will fall
mhm,
in love with other spirits having a human experience, which for a lot of children that I grew up with or teenagers, I remember they were confined to who they were allowed to be friends with or who they were allowed to fall in love with in terms of gender, sexual orientation, religion, and race. So I think somehow my father just had that interconnected way of understanding life, that maybe just came from who knows, some of the stories his family told him, some of the things that his own mom went through. He is the third child. The first two died. His
mm,
mother was very young when she had the first two. Was married very young, 14 or 15. Her babies died the first week that they were born.
mm,
Very rural Mississippi where they just didn't have what they need. So, and it's often dangerous for teenagers to be pregnant if their bodies are just not ready, and someone that young, and then the foods that you need. So, his mother is the result of my great grandmother having to deal with poverty, sexism, and racism in rural Mississippi.
mhm,
And she was so poor she couldn't afford shoes. Her feet hurt. And a white Scottish man propositioned her and said, I'll basically give you shoes if you have sex with me.
mm,
And my grandmother came out of that arrangement. Um, And that, of course, was illegal back then because it was called miscegenation, and you're not allowed to couple with, someone outside of your race. Of course, that happened all the time. The slave masters were always doing that. Um, and and my grandmother, they just really struggled. And then my grandmother um, got married when she was, I think she was 13 when she got married to my grandfather, who was in his early 20s. And her first child died within a week, I believe, of being born. Got pregnant again, child died again. And that's hard. Like I can't imagine the
So
trauma
hard.
of that, right? And then my dad said they finally got a midwife to help with that pregnant with her being pregnant with my father.
Mhm.
He was born early, and he said she learned the midwife knew how to put the oven warm enough to keep me alive but not bake me, and kept him alive, helped her, helped, feeding all this stuff. And I was like, that's another rich history, right? The history
Yeah.
of Black midwives before the medicalization, the colonization of birthing.
Yeah.
And that was the granny midwives, mostly a majority Black, who had that rich knowledge of maternal health and postpartum health and how to keep the babies alive and the mom happy, healthy, alive, using certain herbs and food. They had access to the land to do that. So, my father is alive because of this Black granny midwife being able to help, this 16-year-old girl and her
Wow.
baby, right? And I remember and that story never left my mind because it was on so many levels, just what it took for them to get here and for him to survive, and just the arrangement where my grandmother came out of. And your first two babies dying because you didn't have the health, the food, the nutrition that you needed. I mean, that's
Yeah.
deep, right?
It's a
So I
deep.
think to some degree, I'm wondering those stories as a way to navigate where he goes or how he moved forward with just trying to remember all of what was supposedly lost or taken away because of Jim Crow, because of slavery and colonialism, and how, despite all of that, fast forward to 1982 when they took out a mortgage on that land in New England in a informally segregated town, to
Mhm.
start with that and teaching me all of this stuff. And now here I am, trying to do that on an academic, scholarly, activist, consulting level to bring it all back to that soil microbiome that had been colonized and turned into what's now the United States, but also colonized through the genocide of the people who were living on this soil and the enslavement, right? The capture of enslavement of Africans to work the soil as agricultural workers and stuff like that.
Yeah, that is beautiful and rich, that story, um and it's heavy on all levels as well, because even as you speak about what happened to your dad, I went to Mississippi on a tennis scholarship, and so I got to experience, a lot of that oppression. Being a Black Indian white woman, I sat right in the center of everything, because people didn't know if I was Black, if I was white. So I got to hear stories from both sides, and I got to hear the deep, intense racism that is so prevalent, but obviously people aren't necessarily, like, speaking it out loud on campus, but it was there. It was pervasive. It was deep. I got to witness the abuse to the land through the vast amount of pesticides when I was in Mississippi. We know that the Mississippi River is one of the most polluted rivers in the world with pesticides. We know I got to witness the deep, deep lack of nutrition in Mississippi. We talk about obesity rates being, prevalent 75% of the North American population right now, but 75% of the kids in my class were obese back then. That was in 1994. And that was hard. But back then, I remember, in just you telling this beautiful story, and providing this deep insight into all the reasons why we see obesity, why we see these chronic diseases, it makes me sad because I remember the judgment I had then, just being like, why don't you eat better? Why don't you exercise? And, which is what my entire dissertation is 20 something years later, saying, well, it's not about just eating well. It's not just about exercising. It's about all of this underlying history that is pervasive today. It is still present today. And yeah, and it's interviews like this that I'm hoping will reach people to show that, we have to have these deeper conversations. So one of the other pieces that I would love for you to talk about a little bit more, you talked about the racial biases in the medical system. And if you can just elaborate on that a little bit more, because again, if somebody goes to the doctor and they're ill, and if there's racial biases present, obviously somebody of color is going to be treated much differently than somebody who is white. So if you can just talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that strikes me as troubling is the research that shows that Black people are perceived by white medical practitioners of having higher tolerances for pain than white people. And that unfortunately goes back, if you trace back to scientific racism, I put that in quotes because it wasn't really science, justifying why you can enslave Africans is because they have a higher tolerance for pain. They don't really have spirits and souls. And, that is positioned against the narrative of white womanhood. White women are fragile. They're the pinnacle of morality. And we don't want them to suffer or go through pain. So, fast forward 400 years later, and you've got a majority of people who have either unconscious or conscious biases where they truly believe if a Black person in a situation where they're at the doctor's office or the emergency room is literally saying, I'm experiencing a lot of pain or discomfort here, that you may actually think that they're exaggerating. Here, just go home, take an Advil, it's probably just a headache, when it's actually maybe a brain tumor, or you're having I don't know if aneurysms are painful, but an aneurysm. So data is showing that because of that, that often Black people are not diagnosed or they're misdiagnosed because there's this perception that, the pain isn't real, or you're exaggerating, or you should be able to handle this. Other things, COVID brought a lot of the biases into play that are not necessarily direct, but the ways in which you're supposed to read if somebody may be having difficulty breathing or they're not getting enough oxygen. Check their skin. Are they pale? Are their lips blue? Well, if you're a darker hued person, you're not going to be able to see those things.
Yeah.
Right. So just things like that. Medical equipment, like I'm wearing a smartwatch, it's not very accurate. If you have darker skin, whatever the technology is used so it can check your pulse, check your oxygen level, it is assumed to be detecting lighter or white skin. Right. So I mean, I could give you a whole list of these things. I mean, how many times you had said that your mom practitioner had said, maybe you can get your tubes tied. I was proposed to me that I should get on birth control, I think after I'd been pregnant with my third child. I never asked for that advice. I didn't ask, but it was kind of implied. And I wondered, if I had been a white woman, would that be the case, or would they be trying to help me? Because there is this interesting fear from a lot of white people in the United States that the numbers are going down of white women giving birth to enough white babies, right? So there's just so much happening. There's also, if someone is told you need to eat in a healthy way, and then they're given pamphlets about how to prepare kale, how to eat, carrots, how to, bake a certain way, it's all from usually a Euro-Anglo culinary lineage. So there often isn't the understanding that if you're going to give someone a particular type of food that's supposed to be healthy, don't assume that they have the same culinary heritage as white people. Maybe they might be intimidated thinking, well, how am I going to turn this into my cultural food? Like, how will this play into my cultural food? So maybe I'm just not going to do it. There's so many different layers to why this is a problem, to also pathologizing and criminalizing Black people. And I speak specifically from Black experience and research, because I know there's also Indigenous and
Yeah.
Latinx people and Asian people, but just really just thinking about the pathologization of just Black people, Blackness, and even being blamed for the fact that you might come in with a nutritional related disease, but you know better. Then why are you drinking so much? Why are you smoking so much? Versus understanding that addiction itself is a public health problem. It should not be criminalized. Really
Mhm.
thinking about when there's the current issue around, what is that? My apologies. What is it now that a lot of people are overdosing on because of the,
Oh, opioids?
yeah, opioid crises,
Yeah.
and suddenly it is a public health crisis. And I saw so many people's pictures on there that were white that were being affected by this.
Mhm.
And suddenly it's a public health crisis, but when say crack was affecting majority Black community, it was criminalized. It wasn't understood as
Right.
public health crisis, that no one just wakes up one morning and wants to be addicted, just even the way that's responded to. And then the ways in which the medical profession, when we're focusing on psychological, emotional health, that it's very rare that you can even find a practitioner who understands how systemic racism actually impacts wellness.
Mhm.
So if you go to psychology today, they can help you find a healthcare, I mean, no, I'm sorry, a mental health care practitioner. It's very hard to find someone, you know, who is going to understand how, like, if I'm a Black identified woman, how does systemic racism and sexism impact how I navigate the world? It's so hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there just aren't enough practitioners doing that, but we can look at the pipeline. Why is there the problem with trying to get enough well versed practitioners of color into that pipeline so they can, you know, represent what BIPOC need? It's deep, and I think a lot of people with good intentions who have racial privilege may not even think about this. They just go back to the easy binary of judging, you know.
Yeah, and this it brings up a huge topic. With just you talking about how addiction was criminalized, but now it's a public health emergency, really, and millions of funding put into it because we see so many white people addicted to these opioids that were prescribed by white people. And but that also is what's happening now in the world of trauma, right? That now there is this huge movement to identify trauma in people's lives. So really talking about father-daughter relationships, father-son relationships. But again, I don't hear in a lot of these communities that are talking about, all the trauma and how that relates to addiction, but the racism, slavery, oppression of Indigenous, Black, people of color, how that is not being addressed. But now all of this funding is going into trauma work
Yeah.
as well. And so I do see how, yeah, there's so much work to be
It's
done.
There's so much, but that's why I'm doing the work that I do. And then I'm here in California where cannabis has been, it's been legalized, but there was a time it was called weed, and
Yeah.
three strikes and you're out. But now who dominates what's now been commodified into a new, healthier option? Who
Mhm.
dominates now? White men dominate the cannabis industry. Something that was a sacred herb, it still is. And, people who wanted to use it were criminalized for using this. So, just really thinking about, we're not talking 100 years ago, we're talking, a few years ago. And, that in itself is inequitable. As I read more about the amazing health benefits of cannabis, and not just cannabis where people are eating as edibles, or smoking, for a whole host of mental and or physical issues that they're dealing with. But just really, how did we get to this point, right? And how did white supremacy and colonialism take cannabis, criminalize it, and then now we're at this point where it's been commodified and it's been remarketed, and the story now is that it's this revolutionary way to engage in wellness. Like, I think that's so important. And when we talk
Mhm.
about how racism impacts the wellness industry, same with psychedelics. Who is dominating this right now?
Mhm.
And how can we understand what justice and equity would look like in terms of these quote unquote psychedelics? A lot of
Yeah.
these mushrooms, these herbs, they are sacred for particular indigenous communities. And now for a while you couldn't use them. Again, you were criminalized. It's an illegal drug. And now who owns it? Now it's intellectual property now like all this stuff that is deeply enmeshed in neoliberal capitalism, which is basically from the lineage of, you know, plantation colonialist capitalism. I mean, this is deep.
Yeah, and it's, when I hear you talk about cannabis, it's the same though as any herb that is out there, right? That all of these herbs that were used by, and when I say the word indigenous, I am talking about any person from any land around the world, who was born there, who lived from the land, who knew about 7 generations. They practiced it not because it was a brand, but because it was just the way, like your father said, everything is connected and interconnected. But talking about cannabis makes me think about every single word that herb that is being commodified now as a supplement. It also makes me think about veganism in general right now, that if you look at, standing up and fighting for animals, I understand that for sure. And I love that deep empathy. But doing that without understanding that the majority of Indigenous people from around the world were the original vegans or plant-based, eaters. And by not acknowledging that and thinking that it's a new thing, right? And that we just, as a white person, we discovered veganism and the world should be vegan, and but without addressing all the historical oppression, repression, suppression, and it is also, isn't it further oppression in a way,
Yeah,
especially as it gets commodified?
yeah, I think there's just so much to kind of untangle what you were just talking about. That much of veganism is practiced through consumption, and it's through commodities that have been marketed to the average shopper as cruelty-free, green, whatever. So there isn't a deep genealogy of understanding how that commodity came to you, how it came to be.
Mhm.
Um, I think there tends to be just a lack of critical understanding of how things are historicized, or how histories are erased, and how
Mhm.
commodities get to us, and how like the stories behind it. So when we're focusing on what sounds like you're talking about is kind of white veganism takes a intentional erasure of those histories and of those stories. And if we really understand how whiteness functions, whiteness is about being superior. It's about purity. It's about supremacy. And for the listeners, I'm not talking about skin color. I'm talking about literally a social construct that its consequences are a caste system. So
Mhm.
when I'm talking about whiteness and how whiteness as a process, as a practice, as a philosophy is in is not, let me go back. Veganism is not going to be untouched by that process, at least here in the United States.
Mhm.
So when I was doing my work in 2004, starting off really understanding why is it, A, I'm interested in veganism, but there aren't any BIPOC voices, and two, the most of white vegan books that I'm reading, the people I'm meeting, why is it that there seems to be this myth or narrative that it's a new thing, that this is
Mhm.
something new, revolutionary, and it's once again it's white people who are the saviors. They're on the moral high ground, so they know best. Like, ugh, I can't believe nobody else knows that, it's really important to just have a plant-based diet and to treat animals better. Like, we have to be the ones who are moving forward as the moral warriors. And how is it that that was erased, that history, that history that Queen Afua, like her book Sacred Woman, and so many other folk who are drawing from indigenous foodways, that they were not necessarily vegan, but it was heavily plant-centric, holistic, and things weren't turned into supplements, right? They weren't commodified. It was
Yeah.
part of this whole interconnected web of being. And that the way you're eating and healing the body, mind, and spirit, it was a communal sacred process. But
Yeah.
now we're in this neoliberal capitalist era of veganism where things are commodified. It's a
Mhm.
supplement. It's detangled, and sorry, it's detached from this long history over the last at least 500 years in the United States of whiteness and supremacy. And I
Mhm.
think that's what a lot of people with good intentions in the mainstream vegan movement are missing. They don't even realize they're supposed to be asking those questions
Yeah.
and changing their frames that are more anti-racist and anti-colonial to really understand, why is it the narrative of veganism right now is X, Y, and Z? And
Yeah.
why is it for up to a few years ago it was very, very white?
Mhm.
Is it that BIPOC aren't interested in it? Is it really that BIPOC are so pathological, they just don't care, they'll eat whatever, they don't care? Or is it something else, right? Like, how has white supremacy had a major role in that exclusiveness?
Yeah. That's I think that one question in itself is a massive dissertation there in itself. It is it, I brought this up in a previous podcast, and I love this organization. It's called the Vegan Soul Sisters, started by women in Tennessee. They're, it's amazing what she's done, how she discovered veganism for her daughter's health, for her health. But, and it's a huge but, and this brings us back to just knowledge and awareness of our own histories. Many of the individuals in this group, it's like 60 or 70,000 African American vegans but they're eating all, like, predominantly packaged food.
Mhm.
And I understand that a lot of individuals in Georgia, in Atlanta and Tennessee and Mississippi, there's food budgets that have to be considered. So there's a lot of discussion about how cheap they were able to buy this packaged vegan food. But when I look at the prices, it's still not as cheap as if you go and buy the carrots or the squash or the potatoes or the whole foods in itself. But there's also I see the lack of knowledge, of awareness. And that's also something in looking at the Vegan Soul Sisters, incredible, but also how harmful is that potentially when we look at chronic disease rates, because we're not going to reverse these chronic disease rates while we're eating these foods that are
Yeah,
packaged and processed.
and that's like, that's just another level of nutritional literacy that I see is missing, and not just within BIPOC communities, but the trend in vegan food now is a lot of these meat and dairy analogs,
Mhm.
which I understand it. Like, I understand what the intention is. However, why does a particular substitute need to have 30 ingredients that
Exactly.
half of which I'm not sure about? And, I'm really focused on the sacredness of the gut health.
Yeah.
So a lot of these foods that I my colleagues will get excited about, look at Breeze, there's a vegan version of Skittles. Look,
Yeah.
there's and I'll look at it, I'm like, but there's a vegan version of this. I'm like, there's like 25 grams of high glycemic index sugar in that. Granted,
Yeah.
an animal was not harmed, great, we get it, but this
Yeah.
is gonna harm your gut.
Yeah.
What this is, how do we have a conversation where, like, I'm not judging. What I'm doing is trying to understand it from the gut health perspective.
Yeah.
And there's just a lack of literacy because there's so many foods out there, even organic foods that are not necessarily vegan, they're still so high in sodium, so high in sugar,
Yeah.
ingredients that are not going to allow your GI, your gut health to thrive. And so there seems to be a lack of literacy around, once we go vegan, okay, then what about the nutritional content? But then also how to cook foods that are bulk ingredients. But we also live in a era where most of us don't have time necessarily to cook and sit down in a communal setting food, right? So there are many cultures in the world where people make time to
Mhm.
actually sit down and eat a well-prepared meal. Now, how can you do that in a society where most of us are in a hustle economy now, in the United States here where I am? You don't have time. So, that plays, I think, a lot into that too, is that there is a lack of understanding, how would I prepare, someone drop down some chard and some dried lentils, how would I prepare that into a meal? But people are busy too, and people got
Mhm.
2, 3 jobs, right? So if you package it and now you've made it vegan, I guess that's better than what I was doing before. But why do we still have to set a low bar? What structural and systemic inequities are happening where we're at the point where we can't even get what we need. We don't know how to properly prepare the bulk items. We're not eating communally. Or rushing, maybe having lunch in our car, that 5-minute break we have, gulping down something. You're not chewing your food long enough. Like, it's just, we're in this toxic, fast-paced society, which is basically the outcome of the last 400 or 500 years of a very thick, capitalistic, exploitative society that has damaged human beings, soil, and people to the point where certain processes and practices around eating have been normalized, and we don't realize that it's actually causing illness. And to me, that's just like, that to me is really sad and really upsetting.
Mhm. And I love that you're bringing up all of these, into the everything, the systemic inequalities, the toxic, fast-paced society, not chewing our food, not eating communally. Like these are all really, really important contributors to the high chronic disease rates that we have as well. We know scientifically everything that you just said. This is true. We know people who eat, families that eat together, communities that eat together are healthier. We know that chewing our food is healthier from a scientific perspective, just releasing the saliva, which stimulates all the digestive processes. Um, there is something that two of the previous interviewee, the participants in this research said, and it was, to me, I was shocked, but I also understood it. The first person said, in certain indigenous communities, if you have Pop Tarts and that's all you have, eat the Pop Tarts. And the second participant said, if, food is culture. And so if it is, going to be a food that is culturally accepted and brings you joy, then eat that. And I understood that from the economic perspective, from the lack of access to food, because in Canada and many parts of the US, to get a bag of cherries could cost you
Of course.
$30 to $90. To get a banana, you might not even be able to access fresh food in the community.
Mhm.
And so I love that, she brought up the topic of not shaming people for what they're eating. And that, of course, and I get that. However, at the end of the day, we know that processed refined foods even if we eat them with pure joy in our hearts and love, and we're eating them in community, scientifically, our bodies cannot thrive long term eating these foods. So I'm just curious about what thoughts that brings up for you, because I was left like almost sort of in a purgatory yesterday, trapped, being like, I know what they're saying and I understand that, but I also know the science around food, and which is the science of nature. We're not any different from the tree and the grass and the soil and the horse and the, animals that they're not eating, for the vast majority of the wild animals, they're not eating, processed refined packaged food. Yes, the industrialized pharma animals are, but we see how sick they are as well.
Yeah. And I think that's just hard to answer because, I just remember, I know there are just fond memories of, you know, we didn't do it all the time, but I remember when my mom would take my twin and I to McDonald's and have a Happy Meal. It
Yeah,
was
we
just
did
like,
that once a year for our birthday. Yeah.
that was so like it was just so much fun, and I know it was just joyful. But then the question brings up not judging because if a majority of indigenous people's land that was taken and then they were like, let me put you in the worst situation where you don't have access to even healthier foods, and then you've built a new culinary practice around those foods that are not going to help you thrive. That's just, it would be unfair to just say that, that's I don't like the word bad. It's
Mhm.
like you're put in this situation and then they're trying to thrive, they're trying to find joy. But I'm thinking about this in the context of also with a lot of Black communities are in food apartheid spaces. um I'm just trying to think about this because how do we decolonize what we think is joy? Like, how do we decolonize pleasure? um how how can we somehow fathom a a close future in which certain foods could also bring us joy and pleasure that we could get used to? I mean, there are
Mm.
many things that I loved. I mean, I grew up on a home, like a semi homestead, but I also ate a junk food that gave me pleasure. And I knew, now looking back, I can't eat the same foods. My palate is not used to it. My body literally would probably not be happy if I had a Dr. Pepper, which I loved in college, right? Like,
Yeah.
if you gave me a Dr. Pepper, which is about 40 grams of sugar, I would probably get very sick.
Yeah.
Somehow I adjusted my palate. So how is it now that steamed kale gives me joy? How is it now that just drinking water and not soda gives me joy? I now look forward to my hemp seed smoothies. I crave it, and that
Mhm.
joy. So now I know how I got to that. I have financial privilege, transportation privilege. I have many privileges that have made that easy for me.
Mhm.
So I don't have a solution or answer for you. I know it's very complex, and and to be completely transparent, I didn't grow up insecure. I didn't grow up. I think I have a very rare um experience as a Black person in the United States.
Yeah.
So I understand that, my dad, he's a master gardener. Dude has diabetes. As
Yeah.
much as he loves growing fruit and vegetables, as much as he has access to that, dude still ate in a way that burned out his pancreas because, like,
Mhm.
this is complicated, right? So we talk about, well, once you have that access, then that's all you need. But dude has that access. And still he's like,
Mhm.
the hardest thing it has been in my whole life is to kick sugar.
Right.
Right. And he was addicted to it before, he began doing the homestead route. These are very deep questions that I wish I could have an easy answer for you. But I think about that with my dad. Thankfully, he's still alive. He's almost 80. but he struggles still with diabetes and
Yeah.
that sugar craving. And like occasionally when I'll visit and I'll be like, why do you have Intamins why do you have Intamins? Why don't you just have a date? It's a whole sugar. He's like, but it doesn't taste as good. So he even knows, even after all the things he's taught me, but there's something even deeper, right?
Well,
you know
it's the same as my mom who, we grew up, we had a huge garden when we moved from Africa to Maple Ridge, massive garden. I remember my brothers eating sweet onions. Like I didn't realize onions were sweet out of the garden when they were like 1 year old. It was, we had an orchard as well. My parents bought an old orchard in an urban community. And so all the kids would come jump the fence because I lived right by the school and they would, you know, pick all the apples and the cherries and the plums out of the trees. And so I grew up that way. Then my mom adopted my youngest brother when she was in her 40s. My
Mhm.
mom and dad did. And all of a sudden she's bringing Diet Pepsi in the house. I was like, we never got that except for birthdays and special occasion. And all of a sudden, but I understand you get older, you're just like, it's hard work to do the farming. It's hard work and the food is addictive.
Yeah, and it's just like, what is it trying to compensate for? I mean, there's so much,
Yeah.
but I don't want to say people are eating, a whole pint of ice cream because they're addicts. There's joy
Mhm.
and pleasure, and I don't want to just say these foods are addictive, and like
Mhm.
it just because that also kind of criminalizes and pathologizes too. And I'm
Mhm.
a I practice whole foods veganism, and I do eat what would be considered junk food,
Yeah.
I don't shame myself, I don't guilt myself over it. Um, it's complicated, there are certain days where stuff will happen, usually based on the work I'm doing, because even though I practice veganism and I well known for my Sistah vegan project work, I do mostly full-time diversity, equity, inclusion consulting and work, which is focused mostly on anti-racism. And it can get really frustrating with some of the things or the surveys or the data that come back from some of our clients. Some days I'm like, I don't care. I'm just gonna eat that whole pint of vegan ice cream. I don't
Yes.
care. I just want it. Like I don't like the steamed kale. I don't know. It's just like not doing it for me, or hemp. It's not all the time, but I do it too. But I don't feel guilty. I'm like, I'm just gonna do
Mhm.
it. But then I'm always like thinking to myself, what about that stressful situation? And I reach for that, though I know I'm not gonna sleep tonight. It's gonna screw up my flora, but I'm gonna
Yeah.
do it anyway. But I do know how to replace the flora that I screwed up. I know how to
Yeah.
once I know all that. I'm like, I'm gonna have to do lots of probiotics tomorrow. I'm gonna have to do it, to get things balanced. But so what's going on? Well, I know that. And I wish a lot more people who do practice holistic veganism can just say, oh yeah, by the way, I had 2 donuts yesterday. Yeah, and then by the way, I did this or that. Because I
Mhm.
think one of the things with the whole vegan movement as a health movement, it shows all these perfect gurus. No human being is perfect. That's I
No.
want to see the days where you're like, I work out every day, but yesterday I just decided not to work out. I sat on the couch all day, played video games, and ate a whole box of, sugar cereal. Like
Yeah.
that's who I want to hear from.
Yeah.
Because I think if we start hearing that we're all vulnerable, that nobody is perfect, and veganism or whole foods living, if you choose to just eat holistically and not necessarily veganism, it's not a purity thing. Can we get out of
Mhm.
the purity and supremacy rhetoric? I think that binary of, pure versus impure, and our bodies as this site of purity, but in a way that's been once again colonized, right? And then you shame and judge others. That's not the purity I'm looking for. I'm looking
Mhm.
for the purity of vulnerability. I'm looking for the purity of understanding that we're kind of going through these flows, and sometimes we go backwards, sometimes we go forward in what we're trying to do. I'm looking for like that type of flexible purity, if that makes sense, not a purity that's part of a supremacist binary way of thinking that just makes it much more difficult when we're trying to figure out how to engage in nutritional and health wellness, and at least in the context of North America, which it's really hard to entangle away from how capitalism and colonialism have created this very purist and supremacist rhetoric around everything.
Mhm. Um, So for the last 10 minutes here, I mean, we can go longer if you have time, but I want to respect your time for what we said. You know, we'd spend 90 minutes together in this interview. Um, for moving forward, you know, you have a lot of knowledge about health. You are definitely, like you said, privileged, you know, with transportation, money, lifestyle, a father who had the knowledge. So, moving forward, for somebody who has knowledge and has a lot of information and education around this in so many different areas, you know, is education like one of the answers? Like moving forward, what is it that we are to do to see that systemic change that we want to see in the world?
Yeah, I think, of course, I'm biased, but I really think I don't think people are going to be persuaded by hardcore science. First of all, a lot of us are suspicious of science because of how it's been used historically um, for sexist and racist and colonialist, classist agenda. But I
Mhm.
think it's going to take more than just the scientific evidence showing. I think there's power in cultural storytelling and discovering what what were your ancestors doing. I think it was really powerful for me and a lot of mostly Black people that I met when you learned, wow, we didn't start off as slaves.
Mhm.
I mean, when you start learning the different agricultural and food ways, science ways of a people, your people, that maybe you learn about maybe 1 or 2 pages in K through 12 history book. Just like having those stories, the power of telling those stories with agency, how we were innovative and resilient. I think that's so powerful. And linking those stories to our connections to this interconnected ecosystem that starts off with the sacredness of the water, the soil, non-human animals, and having those stories. I think that's so powerful. But also, how to tell a story if you want to move forward and toward, sustainable futures and bodies and ecosystems, is to do it with unconditional love and without
Mhm.
that judgment. And I think it's really important also moving forward to understand really the role that colonialism and capitalism continues to kind of play in narrating this the like disingenuous abundance. I don't know how else to explain it. That are we going to find a future of health through all of this commodified stuff, even if it's commodified vegan packaged stuff, right? Um,
Mhm.
Still living in an individualistic way, not living communally. I think, and this is not very popular because I think what's even more problematic to talk about in the United States beyond like talking about racism is really problematizing capitalism. I think
Yeah.
you can't really understand how to move forward without understanding not just the history of colonialism and racism, but how sustainable is capitalism?
Yeah.
How sustainable can we be if we continue to move forward in within a capitalist model of being? And that is very dangerous to say. I know that because you don't screw around with capitalism, blah, blah, blah. But my dissertation work, I mean, it focused on decolonial veganism and really questioning what happens when you're commodifying vegan foods within a neoliberal capitalist model that is sustained by racism, poverty, classism, individualism, right? So I think moving forward, we really have to think about alternatives to capitalism. And like I said, I know it's not popular. And I mean, it's empire. You want to mess with empire, but I'm going to put it out there if anyone wants to join me. And we know there's alternatives
Yeah.
because I'm not saying going back to the past is all dandy. We know that there's still many problems before capitalism,
Yeah.
but there are ways that people have been able to function and live more harmoniously without necessarily a capitalist or colonialist model. So it's there.
Yeah. It is there. And I join you on that for sure. I do see how we, and it's, we have to have these conversations because it's what allows us to envision a world, that is beyond this capitalist model that we're in. But you also brought up the point about living communally, and that is something I speak about often, which often gets my butt in trouble because I talk about living communally and people automatically hear communism.
Communism.
Wow, but
Communism.
yes,
Yeah.
and as opposed to being cut off from, just immediately denouncing it because of what you think communism
Yeah.
is, what the media has told us communism is, but what could a new communism look like? And because communism did start off on a very healthy pretense, but of course, just like anything, people can turn it into this evil empire. And
Yeah.
when and so what could that look like? Because again, even though, and I do understand how science has been used against Black people, Indigenous people, so I do understand that people are leery of science, but at the same time, science does show us that communal living is very, very healthy for our soul, our spirit. Economically, it makes sense. We have mothers like you and I that are living in these houses trying to raise our kids and feed them well and make healthy dinners, but why not live together? And
Exactly. Yeah. Just, I mean, that's another thing that we could talk about is, this concept of the monogamous nuclear family.
mhm,
And I just, it's not, but that's what capitalism needs. And like, just,
mhm,
it's not sustainable. And I'm financially, educationally, like, transportationally privileged, and I'm struggling with trying to
totally.
figure all of that out. And I'm partnered, right? So, this concept of individualistic nuclear families versus the communal living and a village. So I know there's ways to do it. I think most people I talk to are fearful of life outside of that capitalist model. Then what will I have? How will I have pleasure? How will I have
Yeah.
joy? Because we've been told that joy comes from you having the choice and the access to abundance of everything. But do you really need all this stuff? So
Mhm,
is a future of abundance quantity or quality, right? So
mhm,
how can we redefine abundance? And I think most people just get really scared. We last 500 years in the United States, it's focused, your happiness is property, right? So you own ownership. So
yeah.
what will my happiness be outside of that? I think it's just really hard for people to envision, or I don't know, understand what that could be like. And how will my happiness be affected? I think how can we decolonize our concept of happiness? And I think that's, for most people, it's scared. I understand that fear is a really great way to control the masses, by telling them, if you didn't have capitalism, then you'd be living in a cave somewhere.
Yeah.
As if one extreme to another. It can't be something else. It's like, I'm glad I live in the United States in this capitalist economy, free market, because I could
Mhm,
be in. Then you take some random country where maybe communism didn't work out so well, and then you use that as an example, versus all the other actually examples
exactly.
historically to the present where things are working actually pretty well in alternatives to capitalism, right? So
Exactly.
I think that's a thing. But I know we're out of time because I actually do have to
Yes.
go over to my next engagement. I don't know if I answered all your questions because I
You
can talk forever. So
I love it that you can, and I know in talking with you more that we would be unpacking even more and more contributors to our high level of chronic disease rates. And I do love this last piece that you did leave us with, which is the individualistic monogamous nuclear family. Nobody has brought that up yet as being one of the contributors to our health being where it's at right now. So I do appreciate everything that you've contributed. And of course, if there's anything else at all that you would like to contribute that you remember, please feel free. You can text it to me, you can voice message it to me. I can definitely include it in the research data as well. And I would love to definitely have you on our podcast again, just as a podcast, not a research podcast.
okay, no,
Um,
that's cool. Yeah, I mean, I didn't even bring in that I did like 4 plant-based pregnancies and birthed at home,
exactly.
and like that's something that I wanted to talk about. Just all the things I learned, and all of the misinformation that is thrown at you,
I
and
would love to do
so
a
that could be
show.
Yeah, that would be something because people ask me that all the time. How is
Oh,
it? Yeah, and it was. I mean, it was a very interesting experience, but being surveilled by so many people, like you're gonna kill your babies because you're vegan. You're gonna kill your baby because you're bicycling up till the 8th month. I actually
yeah.
have a contribution in Carol J. Adams' new book about bicycling while vegan and everyone's unsolicited opinions when I was bicycling with my big belly. Pregnancy, just there, and or finding out that I'm vegan while pregnant. Amazing.
Wow. Oh,
Yeah.
I bet. And that let's do a show on that 100% because it aligns with the work that I do because I help a lot of women who are infertile and their partners who have zero sperm count actually get pregnant after years of being told that they'll never have babies. So it's beautiful. It can happen quickly that the reproductive system bounces back when you do put all of these beautiful nutrients, plant-based whole food nutrients into your body. It's amazing how quickly the reproductive system says, let's do this.
Yeah.
But we're seeing so many women, families struggle in not being able to create families of their own because of basically eating this processed packaged food and the stress that goes along with working in a medical system that thinks that they can solve it through IVF
Yeah.
and hormone replacement when the answer is really in your backyard. It's in the soil, it's in the food.
Yeah.
So let's do that show for sure. And I want to speak to you about seeds of Sankofa. There is so much questions that I had, but everything that you brought was beautiful. It was a gift. So thank you so much for being on
You.
this podcast and being a part of this research.
You're welcome. Thanks for your work, and I love that your program is having, a dissertation portfolio because this makes
Mhm.
so much more sense. So, yeah, Seeds of Sankofa is my master's thesis and my dissertation work using Afro fantasy and Afrofuturism to explore that because no one's going to read my dissertation, but I think people will want to read an Afrofuturistic Afro fantasy novel that talks about the content that was in those two manuscripts.
Well, let's do a third podcast on that alone, and then let's bring your research to light through video, through audio, so people can enjoy it when they're biking and walking and working in their garden, and they'll be able to have access to it. So I would love to do that with you.
That sounds good. Thanks, Nicolette. Is that how
Okay.
you pronounce your name, Nicolette?
Yeah, Nicolette, I love how you say it. It's beautiful. Perfect.
Great.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Breeze Harper, for being on our show. We'll be sharing this with you so you can share it with your audience as well.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay. Enjoy the rest of your day, your family, life, everything, and we'll connect again soon.
Thanks. You too.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.